To begin, a poem. Cascadian lyric. After 4 days of rain, the light falls on green leaves. Salon, glowing brightly, almost from within, then fading with the sky, clouds moving in the leaves. Not two things, or one, but one moment unfolding. Rain and sunlight and leaves within it. Everything within it, without end. If you ask me, what's Cascadian Zen? I'll have to tell you the truth. I don't know. And I mean that in a very specific way. For one of the few things I know about Zen practice, Buddhist practice, the practice of mindfulness, is that it transforms our very notion of self, of having an I in the first place. It unravels the business of I-making, which is, in its own paradoxical way, at the heart of what we might call Cascadian Zen. To be present to a place, to be part of its presence, means letting go of all that impedes our capacity to be, to see clearly, to touch what's beyond being without dishonoring being. A tall order, no doubt, and as natural as water, flowing downhill, reshaping the hill and itself. I'd like to share 5 thoughts I've had on Cascadian Zen, and I'd like to do so as a poet, which is simply to say, with all that I am, not merely the part that was trained to think logically, with its attendant and attenuated sense of self. Which is also to say, with more than I am, open to what comes and can only be shared through poetry, through words that say more than they say. So here's my first thought. The phrase Cascadian Zen can be a door, a doorway, but it can also be a wall. The notion of Cascadia serves beautifully to remind us that entities like Washington, or Oregon, or British Columbia are political creations, creatures of maps that don't necessarily correspond to the earth beneath our feet. My husband David, for instance, was born in what we now call Vancouver Island, and I was born in what we now call Seattle. But it makes more sense to say we are both from Cascadia than to say we're each from Canada or the United States. Those are bureaucratic categories. Cascadia reminds us that we share, in this watershed and region, a common bond to rain, water, the presence of the ocean, and the great evergreen forests and their shadows. Cascadia opens a door to what lies beyond doors. At the same time, if we think of Cascadia as merely a better map, we'll have failed to touch a deeper and more important map in our minds. It's as easy as it is dangerous to substitute Cascadia into a sense of home and country, molded and modeled, molded by and modeled on the idea of the nation state, which is a one-eyed idea, presupposing one people, one language, and one set of borders, one history. Any true history is a history of histories. Forgetting that, we resort, among other things, to the mindless building of walls. Cascadian Zen, to be Cascadian Zen, would transform our notion of Cascadia. A second thought. Zen, too, can be a wall or a door. For many, Naturally enough, Zen connects directly to Japan, and of course that's part of the story. But it's no small matter for clarity in one's practice to ask how much of one's practice is what we might call Zen, and how much of it is Zen as embodied, often humbly and profoundly, by several particular strands of Japanese culture. For Zen is not, and has never been, the province of one place. My own practice, such as it is, has been nourished powerfully by Thich Nhat Hanh and Vietnamese Zen, which bears an important and often unacknowledged connection to the history of American war and involvement in Vietnam. And to see things clearly, we must also include China and Chan Buddhism, and India, and the entire Sanskritic and Brahmanical tradition against which the Buddha came to his practice. All of which is simply to acknowledge that Zen Buddhism is in as much danger as any other ism of falling into a one-eyed conception of community. What are the borders of Zen? Who gets to draw them? Who gets to decide who is in and who is out? And who dares to open the door? Cascadian Zen, to be Cascadian Zen, would transform our notion of Zen. Thought number 3. To speak of transformation returns us to practice, for practice alone transforms. In fact, I am far more at ease talking of the practice of Zen, or the practice of Cascadia, than speaking of Cascadian Zen. And far more at ease still practicing without recourse to words. Yet words, too, can point us on our way. A well-said word can be the fruit of one's practice and can nourish the practice of others. And so, if I had to say something about Cascadian Zen, I would say it begins in the body, because our body is our most immediate connection to the earth. And I do not mean simply the body of our body, with its organs and limbs and capacities to perceive, but also the body of the earth, the bodies of the earth, bodies of water, bodies of land, bodies of plants and trees and fellow beings, bodies of sound. Just as practitioners in Japan embodied Chan Buddhism in their own time and place, practitioners in Cascadia would embody their practice in this time and place, which begins in the body, with all its profound suffering and wisdom. And the body of our place, the bodies of our place, with all their profound suffering and wisdom. How do we sit here in Cascadia? How do we stand? How do we walk? How do we eat or lie down? We await a sutra of the evergreens, a Madrona and Cedar Sutra, to go with the Diamond and Heart Sutras. We await a weaving of all that is here, and more than all that is here. And my own very limited experience suggests that one way to begin is to practice with one's whole body, which, touched deeply, is also the body of the cosmos. And so, a fourth thought and caveat. It can be exhilarating to invoke the cosmos, as exhilarating as invoking the planet, or the nation, or any other of our terms for bigness out there. Yet, if we rush too quickly to bigness, we lose sight the one living connection we have to our bigness. Our small selves, our small bodies, our small places on earth, our small practice. We can only touch bigness through smallness. It is by touching our own smallness deeply that we most deeply touch what lies beyond big and small. Even Cascadia may be too big. A more congenial word might simply be home. Cascadian Zen would then be the practice of home, the practice of being here, the action of homing, of hearing and hearing, listening to the place, allowing our awareness to include this place and its places as an integral part of our practice. Then Cascadian Zen becomes as natural and inevitable as grass growing in the sunlight. And a fifth thought, which is also a prelude to another poem. As I see it, Cascadian Zen, in its depths, would foster the paucity of one day being native to this place. And so, perhaps, a better phrase than even the practice of home would be the practice of dwelling, because dwelling places the accent on the action of being here in all its dailiness and detail. And I mean being here in the largest sense. For to practice being here requires a whole understanding, a radical inclusivity, with a central and key place for the indigenous elders and forebears who have practiced and still practice the art of dwelling here. It would have room, for instance, for the insight of Chief Sealth, who is reported to have said that even should his people perish, these shores will swarm with the invisible dead of my tribe. And when your children's children think themselves alone in the field, the store, the shop, upon the highway, or in the silence of the pathless woods, they will not be alone. And it would have room for the people and practitioners of color who are also a part of this place and who have been important teachers to me as to others. And it would have room for the women of this place who have been and are great lights, great teachers, many of whom are right here, right now. And it would touch both the trauma and the capacity for resilience that we all carry in our own bodies, our own hearts, each in our own way and ways. So I'd like to offer another longer poem that speaks to another aspect of the relationship between Cascadia and Japan. It is something that I wrote for an exhibit about the histories of Japanese Americans on Vashon Island. And it consists of 5 parts to match the 5 parts of the exhibit as it was laid out. The hope with which Japanese settlers arrived, their struggle to build a community, the trauma of their incarceration during World War II, their extraordinary resilience in the years that followed, and the identities, in the plural, that they and we live with now. I believe this poem has something to say about Cascadia. And as far as Zen and Zen practice, I will leave that to you in the poem. Now, you've been listening quite intently, and it's for which I'm deeply grateful. But because this is after lunch, I'm going to invite all of you to take a silent stretch break. Thank you for that. Thank you. The poem is called Here. A poem in 5 parts. 1. Perhaps you have come from across the water. Perhaps you have come from across the plains. Perhaps you have come to this place for generations, centuries on centuries, before centuries existed. A word from another land that has not yet set sail. However you come to this place knowing its places or hoping to know, hoping in new possibilities. You build the long dwellings for families together, or raise a rough cabin while clearing a new field, or plant many crops on land you can't own, hoping in time to make it your own and call your new home your home. As it had been for you before men with their ships named it for people who might never see it. You are so many people, you who are here, even if you seem to be gone. 2. Suppose now of all the people you are or could be, you arrive here this time alone from Japan. You leave what you know to work in the fields or to be a man's wife you know only from a picture. However you come, you picture a new life. You struggle and delight in family and neighbors. You work with others from near and from far and make a new life beyond your own life. Places to gather, places to pray, places to learn and work for what's right. A world of places and people that connect, knowing our strength together. 3. And when the news comes that they come with questions, you draw on that strength to burn the old pictures, keepsakes, mementos, triflings, treasures, even the dolls in honor of your children, anything that looks Japanese. You draw on that strength as you pass your old church, as you board an old ferry, as you ride an old train and take your 2 bags into stalls where you'll sleep, heat and dust filling the air. For months and then years you draw on that strength, beneath the barbed wire, beneath the metal guns, beneath the incessant, unspoken suspicion, the oaths that divide you and send you to fight for a nation that puts you away. You draw on that strength till there seems nothing left, and perhaps in your case there will be nothing left. Your land and home gone, your neighbors dispersed, even these years gone from your mind, a childhood destroyed, hidden so deep beneath layers of pain that even the wound disappears. 4. But you do not give up. You move back or move on. You've learned to endure what seemed unendurable with more grace and more dignity than you'd known you had. You pick up the pieces that are left to pick up. You prosper as you can, or at least raise the children in hope that your children will prosper in time, though perhaps at the price of silence at the table, stories unspoken for years, or forever, or for now, which extends as long as it must to keep your head high and your heart still healing. For the heart that endures is the heart that keeps beating, resilient and buoyant, even as you pass from this world to the next, passing your heart to us. 5. So look as you look down and look up. See the new land as old as our hearts. See the bright sky that shines on us all, and know that this story is one and is many. A story about you, even if you've never heard it. A story of us all in all that we are. Parts of one heart beyond what we see, seeking a home that is home to many places, home to many people and stories and faces, all of them welcome and free. Thank you. So that's more or less what I wanted to say. And I would be curious to hear what you have to say, or wonder about out loud, or ask. Yes?
Thank you so much for that idea of the practice of dwelling. That just is something that I'll be thinking about in the way that I dwell in the stanza and I dwell in the land. And yeah, thank you for that.
The philosopher and historian Ivan Illich writes that to dwell is to inhabit one's own traces, which is a phrase that means a lot. Yes?
I too was struck by the concept of dwelling and the practice of dwelling. I loved that. And I was also sort of reflecting on the etymology of dwelling, because it's one of the few, like every once in a while we get throw out these words and they have roots in English, and that's from Anglo-Saxon dwell on, which is it's like to lead astray and to distract, which is kind of an interesting concept to think about as a form of resistance and as a sense of being in a place, rather than kind of, it's almost like anti-colonial in that sense of like there's no certain stream or goal orientedness about it, but rather in the concept of this particular Western language, it's like, oh, you're led astray, you're distracted from that colonial aspect, that conquering aspect, and considering it's from Old English, that's probably what they meant, right? You're not out conquering, but it's, so I was just kind of reflecting on that, and I don't really have a question about it, but I thought that was interesting.
I mean, home, as all words, is also a door or a wall. I mean, as soon as you have a homeland, as soon as you fix your notion of a homeland, you're done. You've stopped seeing. I mean, you're just here, right? And yet, to really be in and of a homeland is an extraordinary gift. So yes. No, I love that you brought etymologies in, because I've been thinking about this word that has come up yesterday and today, spontaneous, which at a surface I would propose one of our sort of surface definitions. Being spontaneous in the moment, doing whatever occurs to you in the moment, which is true enough. But the root of spontaneous has to do with doing something of one's own accord. It has to do with your nature, your inner nature. That's spontaneity, is expressing your being, your inner nature, your Buddha nature, whatever phrase makes sense to you in the moment here now. That's spontaneity. That freedom is spontaneity. And the word offers that gift to us through its roots. Even the idea of words having roots is such a beautiful idea. Words penetrate into the soil. Words penetrate into the soil of our own experience. Words grow into our own experience, and they may blossom, but not when you expect. 20 years may go by. Oh, that's a flower. I hadn't known that until just now. There's another hand over here somewhere, I thought. Yes.
I loved your expression, one-eyed. The one-eyed, the struggle is against the one-eyed notion of Cascadian, just as it's a notion of, really a one-eyed notion of nation, any nation. And I was wondering how you spelled "I."
I would like to say I didn't spell it. And you can hear it. But I mean both. I mean, I take that phrase, and in fact, I made a note to myself to add something in, and then I forgot to add it in, so I get to do it now, spontaneously, which is that. I was talking about different strands of what we might call Zen or Zen Buddhism and so on. I meant at the time to include also that at least my own practice has also been nourished by by Sufis, by my Okinawan great-grandmother, by St. Ignatius, in fact, and his spiritual exercises, particularly his appendix on the discernment of spirits, to which I commend your attention, should you be intrigued. Hindu saints from South India, women poet saints from the 8th century, from the 12th century. So those are all part of what's going on in here. So one-eyed I took as a way to speak of something from Thomas Merton in an extraordinary essay of his called Gandhi and the One-Eyed Giant, which is in a book published by New Directions, which is called Gandhi on Nonviolence. And Merton went through and he pulled statements from Gandhi about nonviolence and organized it under certain headings and so on. But the essay is a fabulous essay, written, must be sometime in the 1950s. And I read it when I was a student, and then I reread it on September 13th or 14th, 2001, and it felt to me like the best thing written about 9/11 that I have known. So I commend that to your attention. Yes?
I too share your enthusiasm for spontaneity, and I wonder what you think of this possibility. You know, it's the logic of the word spontaneity maps in some interesting ways, coincidentally, on the ancient Taoist word for nature, Ziron, which, as you know, is one of the two kanji is the character self, you know, of itself, happening of itself. And then when you begin to think of that was, how shall we say, the movement of Tao, the Buddha nature of things, the ancestors as, the practice of mountains and waters, it does then cast doubt on spontaneity as what we normally think it is, which is spontaneously I do whatever I want. Mm-hmm. That's so that word again, you're doing a really great job of flagging friendly danger of all words. Because, spontaneously destroys spontaneity.
Yeah. Well, one way to put it would be, who is being spontaneous?
Ego. Ego loves spontaneity.
That could be a koan. Who is being spontaneous now? For whatever reason, this doesn't seem to be directly connected, but that reminds me of another thought that I've had listening to conversations and discussions that we've been able to share yesterday and today, at least as we perceive worldly time. And that has to do with water and compassion. Because one of my teachers, a 12th century Tamil woman, poet, and saint named Abbayar, uses an old Tamil word, which is still very much in use, Iram. Iram means wetness, moisture, water. If I go walking in the rain and I come back into a house, my hosts or friends or family might say, Iramaya, you're wet. Very common word. It is also a key Tamil word for compassion. I'll give you an example. There's a short poem in which she said, I'll give it to you in the Tamil. She says, Nallarurvar kaseidu bugaram, kalmel yerathu polkanume, Alladel iramala nenjatar indu bugaram, neermel yerathirku ner. And she uses this phrase, iramala nenjatarku, one who does not have wetness, moisture, water, compassion, love in one's heart. Nenjam is a word for the chest, the heart, is the whole heart region. And so the whole poem is about a practice of gratitude and remembrance of things that are done. So I've translated the poem, good done to a person of character, letters etched in stone. Good done to a person who lacks ethics and love, good done to a person who lacks ethics and love, letters traced upon water. And so even here in this poem where we have this image of water, the life-giving substance of element of water is also used as a metaphor for forgetfulness. You write words in water, they're gone, even as you're writing. That's what happens when you don't have this. Somebody does something nice to you, you don't even see it. And so it's interesting to me that Tummel, which comes from a land quite different from Cascadia, something that I know every time that I go there. I mean, I can feel it in the way that my flesh and muscles and tissues hold the heat. My friends in the village that I am a sort of long-distance member of, they'll put their hand on my arm and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, you're just burning up." And I'll put my hand, and it's like 104 degrees out. Of course it's burning up. But my friends, I mean, I'll put my hand on their arm and they'll be as cool as can be. So, this is, to finish this little digression, we talk about being warm-hearted in English. In Tummel, the warm-hearted person is the cool-hearted person. Because in the heat of summer, it is coolness that refreshes. In the heat of summer, it is cool water that refreshes. Was there a hand over? Okay.
I was going to ask if you could repeat the 12th century Tamil poet.
Abbayar. Often transliterated Avvayar.
Thank you.
There's a book of her poems that I've translated a number of her poems in a book that I've titled Give, Eat, and Live, which is a quote from one of her poems.
Thank you.
One more thought, actually, that your comment, Jason, reminds me of, which is another theme that has been weaving its way through our time together, is that of improvisation. Composition as a form of spontaneous improvisation. And the way that we can enter into the unforeseen. Wendell Berry has a wonderful essay called The Unforeseen Wilderness, which I think speaks to this thing in his own region and way. But what I love about the word improvisation is how it connects to music, and how that suggests to me the possibility that to be spontaneous or to improvise with all of who we are is to allow one's own music, one's own song to be embodied in the world, and to allow all of our songs to be embodied in the world. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, provocations? Yeah.
So, thank you so much. And you told me this morning that you were actually a philosophy major, and certainly recognize that in the way you tie things together. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about dwelling and becoming native. You mentioned Elitz shortly, briefly. Also speaks about, if I remember correctly, riding a bicycle, that's sort of touching and bringing us more into place than moving fast in our cars and these kinds of things, right? So is there something about the pace in which we move that ties us closer to the land, that recognizes it as our home, as a sense of dwelling? I wonder if you can say, I mean, it's a very general question, I know, but maybe you can do something with it.
Elliot says wonderful. He talks about moving at the speed of our bodies, and for him that involves a recognition of certain limits. And so I think it was in Energy and Equity. He talks about the speed of a bicycle, and this is a non-electric powered bicycle he's talking about. Because with the idea that speed, makes sense for human beings embodied. And there's a very interesting insight in Illich, which has to do with tools, and the way and the possibility that tools, or I should say it this way, the potential that any tool can either enhance our capacity to be, or to be interconnected, to interbe to use Thich Nhat Hanh's phrase, to be in more full and full-hearted communion with each other, or conversely cut us off from those things. So I think one of the sort of a good emblem of that now would be the cell phone, which simultaneously connects us and disconnects us. And I think it's a very live question. To what extent does a cell phone connect us more deeply to our fellows? And to what extent does it disconnect us from our fellows because we're playing with this little piece of plastic and silicon and electrics, battery and fossil fuels, all of that's in there. There was another thread I wanted to follow with your question. But it may have escaped me.
I'd like to add something about bicycles.
Yes.
In Vancouver, we have bike paths devoted just to bicycles. And there's one in my neighborhood, and it has become quite frightening to pedestrians because the people who ride bicycles now travel at such speeds. And I saw a woman hit the stop sign because she couldn't stop on her bicycle. They hit dogs, they hit people.
Well,
so it's not, that's traveling beyond the speed of the body.
And I think that part of it has to do with this new phenomenon of electric-powered bicycles. These are bicycles that have motors attached to them.
No, these are just ordinary bicycles.
Well, that happens too.
Yeah.
What your comment reminds me of, though, is which brings this question of threshold. Like, even with a bicycle, it ain't so simple, right? Because even with a bicycle, there's what is a speed that's appropriate for this place, this bike path, right? And same thing with, what happens when you do introduce electricity into a bicycle? Is it still a bicycle? Or is it really just a kind of moped in disguise as a bicycle? And what does that mean for us who travel on the bicycle, who are not necessarily beings meant to be moving at those speeds?
The former Seattle poet Magid Zahir has a line, "A bicyclist's sense of entitlement."
I remember the thing I wanted to add, Gerard, which has to do with Illich, who I've learned a lot from, especially on this question of tools. But and something I really appreciate about him is that he is always aware of the complexity and the contradictions involved with it. For instance, he had a friend who was dying halfway around the world, and he had been writing about how much oxygen is used up flying in an airplane. And he had a calculation involving, a herd of elephants and how much oxygen they would need, and that's used up in that flight. And he goes on the plane to sit with his dying friend. And that's all somehow part of it. That's the piece that fascinates me. And it, drives my logical, philosophical mind absolutely bonkers. Because that part of my mind would love to have a nice, an algorithm. Here are the conditions, therefore I do this, and it's great. Oh well. Yes.
Just as a fellow Bashan, I guess I could just anything to your point. I can speak to the enormous difference between your carbon fiber racing bike spandex clad, fendered wind-up headlight. There's a 20-mile-an-hour difference, especially going downhill. So yeah, there are those that are more entitled than others. I love riding around that island on my little rusty bike during the summer and taking it all in. I agree with you that with the right ancient equipment that doesn't allow you to go 40 miles an hour, it is the right speed. But yeah, there's a spectrum there. But I was just going to ask if you had any experience with the Otsuka farm in your research for that poem, because I just a subjective experience for me, but I grew up right next to one of those farms, one of those Japanese American farmers who was interned. And I really like the line about silence, around the table, because I remember from a very young age going and visiting his farm. My dad either borrowed or leased some of his land that was right behind our house. Like his farm was like an L shape around our property. Because that blue house across from Over Park, if you're familiar, that's where I grew up for the first 15 years or so. And Toke I just remember him being, he would never mention any of those experiences. And I remember my mom, once I was old enough, kind of teaching me about it. And once we had a little unit in school or something, but I just remember all these, he dropped these he was very soft-spoken, he dropped these little one-liners about the land, though, you know, and that was kind of my first, I think, educational experience with, like, ecology, you know, came from him and that culture, so I not really question, but I really appreciate the poem.
I appreciate you mentioning Tokutsuka, who's somebody who I didn't get to meet. But, and when I was working on this poem, I realized something, because I was reading newspaper clippings from Vashon history and Bruce Holman's wonderful book about Vashon history. And I realized something interesting about my own life. So, in the history of Japanese and Japanese American people on Vashon, the first people who came to the island tended to be single Japanese men. And they would come and they were not allowed legally to own land, so they would work on people's land. And then they started families, and things went from there. And they often lived in small little, cottages or shacks on the sides of properties, the sides of fields and so on. When I first moved to Vashon, I moved to a friend's farm, where I wanted to try an experiment in what Gandhi calls bread labor. I wanted to work part of the day to earn vegetables and a place to stay, and then I wanted to figure out what in the world this poetry thing is the rest of the day. And I happened to move to land that had been one of Otsuka's farms. And I happened to move into a picker's cottage at the back edge of the field. I had no idea of the history. She had a farm, they had these old picker's cottages. It was free, I could stay there, I could pick vegetables and write in the mornings. And it was only years later that I realized, I unwittingly, or the circumstances of my life were such that I was experiencing the smallest taste of moving and working on a farm that wasn't my farm, and staying in an unheated shack at the back field, and making my own little life there, which brought me my own experience and made me more able, at least, to imagine part of my way into the experience of some of the Japanese American settlers on Vashon. So I thank you for mentioning Tokutsuka.
Tok is I was just talking about it last night up at the review with Jake. We were like, it's really neat to hear you speak about it so openly, right? After I was thinking about it, and
thank you.
It's a big part of my upbringing in my early years.
Well, unless there are no more comments or questions in this moment, I thought I'd share one last thing with you. The poet William Blake once said that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite, which is to say, I would add, infinitely interconnected. And at the same time, as free as the wind. The wind that can carry us to our truest destination. So that even when it seems that we've been torn apart, we know that's not the end of the story, nor the end of the turning of the heart. Thank you.